Hello, and thank you for joining us in the Continuing the Conversation studio. Continuing the Conversation, or CTC, is an arts and education network founded and organized by alumni from the Arts and Education program at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. Our goal is to provide spaces for conversation that are important to advancing work in the arts and education sector, and to get as many people as we can across sectors engaged in those conversations. You can join in today by commenting on our website, aieconversation.org, or by tweeting with the hashtag AIECTCchat. I'm Eliza Greenberg. I'm a co-chair of CTC and an alumna of the AIE program, and I'm excited to welcome our guests to discuss the social responsibility of the arts educator. We're joined in the studio by Melanie Brown, a 2007 alum, and an education program officer at the Heinz Endowments. Marit Dewhurst, a 2003 alum of the AIE program and a 2009 graduate of the doctoral program at the Harvard Ed School. And Marit is currently the director of the Art Education program at the City College of New York. We're also joined by Rosalie Norris, who is a student in the Arts and Education program at Harvard and a theater artist and educator in Boston. And as always, we're joined by Steve Seidel, the director of the AIE program at Harvard. And we have a big, exciting group today, and we're going to be discussing a very important and relevant topic. So, Steve, I hand it off to you to get the conversation started.
Great. Thank you so much, Eliza. Hi, everybody. We're taking on the topic of the social responsibility of the arts educator today, and this is always a kind of critical concern. We all know, working in the arts and working in education, that our work does not exist in a vacuum. We can't pretend that we go into a classroom or a school or any other learning environment and close the world out. The world is always in the room, and we're always in the world, and we have responsibilities to see what's there in front of us. Arts educators, like everyone in the United States and really around the world, have been catalyzed in the last weeks and months in this country, around the the grand jury decisions in Ferguson and in Staten Island, and there's been a great deal of activity and energy around questions of racism and social justice. We know that while the focus in those decisions and in those cases have been on the police and their relationship to the black community and to black men in particular, we know that those issues are very, very alive and real and play out in powerful ways inside all of the schools and other learning environments that we all work in this country. So what do we do? How do we take what we have and what we know through the work that we do as artists and educators, and try to contribute our best to trying to address and influence the direction of these issues. So the question that we have for today is, how are artists and arts educators uniquely equipped to enrich, deepen, and catalyze moments of social awareness around critical questions about race and social justice? And I'm really glad that Marit and Melanie and Rosalie are all here. We're just going to try to open this up and have some conversation among ourselves, and we hope that that conversation is useful to others as well. Why don't we go to Pittsburgh? So Melanie's in Pittsburgh. Why don't we go to Pittsburgh? And Melanie, you know, as Eliza said, you're working in the philanthropic sector, but you are never really more than a half a step out of schools, or maybe you're really both feet in schools in Pittsburgh. Tell us a little bit what this question brings up for you when you hear it.
Thank you, Aliza. Thank you, Steve. So my work at the foundation, I'm the education program officer here, and I also work a lot with my colleague in the arts and culture program. So I feel like I sort of have, if I were to have 3 feet, I guess I would have one in philanthropy, one in schools, and one in out-of-school time arts programs. And you know, of course, this issue and the things that have been happening in the news in this country cannot go unseen. And we've had a lot of our grantees asking us how to respond or asking for resources in order to respond to engage young people. You know, we were at the foundation, we were able to take a group of people last November to the Race Forward conference in Dallas to talk about the work around racial justice work, and those are the conversations that we're trying to have internally and trying to understand how our grant making improves racial justice for African Americans. I would say with the arts, I think the arts are uniquely positioned to address culture in a way that most other areas don't. I think just by nature of my experience of being a teacher and being in the AIE program, that I don't really see anything else that can sort of disrupt systems and processes and challenge the status quo quite like the arts. So I think it's, you know, as a field it's uniquely positioned, and I think for those, what I say to educators is the same thing that I would say to arts educators, which is being able to do a self-reflection of we're all socialized into the system of oppression and racism in this country, and so really being able to reflect on your own experience with racism or oppression or discrimination and bringing that into your work. And this is a lifelong process that I think people have to go through. So I think that's a responsibility of the artist. We talk a lot about reflection of one's practice, but I think that reflection of one's socialization into institutional and structural racism is equally important. My colleague who I mentioned in the arts and culture program here, Justin Lang, always talks about risking your privilege. So everyone has a level of privilege that somebody else doesn't have. So at the foundation, I'm privileged to do the work that I do and to make grants and to move money in different places, and I have to be willing to risk that privilege in order to bring attention to these issues, which can sometimes be difficult for people to talk about. The other thing I'll just say is, you know, I think that we have to hear from and learn from the people that we work with. So if it's young people in our programs who are from different communities, not just to engage with them around the arts, but to really understand what their reality is, and then to use that when we think about how we build programs and create things that people want to be connected to.
Great. Melanie, thank you. I'm not going to say a lot, but it just, one of the things that you kind of remind us of is how many levels this work needs to go on in. So internally within individuals, there's just a constant level of work, but then with our immediate colleagues and friends, there's real work to do. And then it keeps expanding out into our communities, local work, but also you talked about the trip to Dallas and the national conversation that we need to be having as the arts sector in education. And certainly as artists in education with the rest of the people in education. Marit, let's, you know, why don't you just pick up and share from your perspective in New York.
Great. So I'm Marit, and I'm the director of the undergraduate and graduate art education program at City College. So working predominantly with pre-service teachers who are going to be out in the schools, also teaching artists and kind of the full spectrum there. And actually, a couple things I want to pick up off of what Melanie said in this larger question of why the arts are uniquely situated with this. And I think some of the stuff that Melanie just named in terms of disrupting systems, this idea that it's hard to talk about race, it's hard to talk about power and privilege, especially when you have it. It makes a lot of people uncomfortable, makes a lot of people scared. It's a sudden silencer in many situations, as we all know. And also this importance of learning, of needing to learn from each other, like really genuinely like learn what is somebody else's experience. I think if you take just those three things that Melanie named, those are all things that are absolutely within the DNA of making art. In making art, we are sharing our experiences. We are putting out things that are difficult to talk about, and it gives people this kind of like almost like the transitive power, like you can talk about something indirectly because you're talking about the work of art. So we can have a conversation about racial injustice and like the absolutely gross disparities in our country, but through a work of art. So suddenly it relieves a little bit of the emotional tension that I think a lot of people, and the fear that a lot of people have, especially white people. I'll speak from my own experience. So I think that when we think about what is it that the arts bring, it's that like really rare kind of chemistry that can happen when you can enable those conversations and kind of break them apart. I think one of the things that was really interesting to me, so we had this teach-in, so right after the Eric Garner grand jury announcement, in New York City there was kind of like, people had been watching Ferguson. There was a lot of conversation about that, but there's something about like a tipping point that happened, right? And all of a sudden, like the emotion felt really palpable. And so, in our program, we were kind of thinking like, well, I was sitting on the train. And I was like, well, what do we do? And I was like, well, this is what we do. Like as arts educators, I mean, this is what we do in our program. Like we talk about how to engage young people in race. We talk about how to engage them in conversations about sexual orientation. So like, why don't we make sure that all of our current students have the opportunity to come up with some quick activities, some quick lesson plans? And so we kind of threw out this like, hey, anybody come together for this conversation. And I think what was fascinating to me is I was expecting maybe, it's 4 days noticed on a Monday night in winter. I was expecting maybe 20 people, and we had 70 show up. And it was the hunger to engage in those conversations, to me, was actually really heartening. Because it was this idea that, like, oh, right, like, this is what we do. Like, and the people in the room, they were people from all over New York City. They were all races. We had all sexual orientation, all gender. It was a really interesting group of people. And people there were just, like, ready to go for it. And I thought that that was really interesting, given the sort of despair I was hearing in the news and on all the blogs, and to be in a room where people were like, oh yeah, people, this is our game, we just do this. So here's how we engage young people. Let's just step up our actions. Like, this is how it happens. And to me, I think that validated that idea that, like, this is why we are in art. This is why we are in education, because it's where these things come together and can give some kind of sense of agency when it really does feel like everything else is falling apart. And I'll say one other thing about that is that, in debriefing some of these conversations with people around the teach-in, one of the stories that came up was there was a school in New York City in the Lower East Side that planned this kind of amazing school-wide intervention about all of, they were going to, a group of students march down to the DA's office with a letter, and they did a whole series of little workshops throughout the day. Some students watched Fruitvale Station, other people engaged in making protest posters, and it all started with the art teacher, which I thought was a really good point, right? Because here is the space in a school where we're still not totally inundated with tests, where we're still able to allow students to express themselves, where there's still some freedom of thought and freedom of curriculum changes, that I think the art teachers are often in this place where they can be like, okay, yeah, I'm going to throw out that lesson that I was going to do on, on two-point perspective. Or I'm going to throw out that lesson I was going to do on improvisation techniques, and we're going to deal with what's happening today, because that's what matters. And because that's what we do as artists. That's just the nature of our being. And so to me, it was just kind of I left our teach-in, I was excited, because like a lot of people had come, but I was also like, yeah, they probably should have, because that's what we do. I don't know. I think if I could sort of see if I can move us a little more, the things that I've been left thinking about are this idea of like, how do we just constantly try and create those spaces? Because to me it was like, oh, all we have to do is like open up the conversation and people show up. It's like that if you build it, they will come kind of thing. But also I kind of got stuck on this idea of what are these tipping points. And this idea that like I think, and I think in our conversation already, we often think that this is like an everyday conversation. Like we need to be doing this every day. But why are we waiting for these tipping points? And I was talking, one last story, I'll stop after this. I'll mute myself. But I was talking with some colleagues who are museum educators recently, and they were talking about, like, what do I do? Like, I've got a school group coming into the museum. They're going to be here for an hour. Like, am I just supposed to bring it up? And my answer was yeah, because, like, why not? Like, what have we got to lose, right? So a group is coming in. Maybe, yes, we want our tours, we want our teaching to be really responsive to students' needs. So maybe you bring it up as the educator, and they don't pick it up and run with it. Maybe that's okay that time. But if you don't bring it up, they're not going to necessarily do it. So, like, just constantly acknowledging that these things, that race matters, that power matters, that privilege matters, and making it okay to talk about it, I think can be a really bold move and a really everyday move.
Great, great. Okay, Rosalie, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I'm gonna go off a lot of what Marit just said, which is that so conversation is a huge component to this, and I think my experience just here on campus that we've had a great deal of conversations, and along with that has been sort of a critical or almost like a personal concern from folks that having a cerebral experience of this is not enough, and that I think it's especially easy at an institution like Harvard to be to get very comfortable in a classroom or conversation environment and to not think past our own thoughts and to take a step into action. So for me, where I think the arts is particularly capable of moving beyond what other educational spaces maybe can offer, is to offer a more visceral experience of a social justice orientation. So, like, for example, I was helping to organize a few of the Ferguson responses, and one of actually a former Hugsy student, Mila Thigpen, is that her name? Mm-hmm. Mila. She's now getting her PhD in dance, and she was talking about choreopolitics, and she was talking about how in some of the protests that have been happening, that there is power and there's politics to when, like, for example, a white person puts up their hands and says don't shoot at these protests, as opposed to a person of color, because the reality of those situations in the real world is incredibly different, and they don't mean the same things. But that she was sort of armed with a vocabulary that came from the arts that I think really enriched that conversation and made it deeper. So to me, that's like another way in which the arts and social justice-minded education can really like collaborate. And just to reiterate that, it's like to have an embodied experience and to have a vocabulary of the aesthetic of what it is to embody those things.
So let's, Melanie, Marit, do you want to pick up on any of that? Melanie?
You know, I think, Marit, something you said about the story you told about the teacher who was afraid, sort of, you know, can we talk about these things? I think that's so important to remain relevant, is, you know, it's okay to throw out the curriculum. It's okay to throw out the plan. You know, these issues, I think why there's sort of, you mentioned things felt like they were getting, it was a palpable feeling of people wanting to respond and wanting to engage. And so it's easy to respond then, but I think when we approach this work, it's ongoing, right? It's you know, it's very visible now with the recent grand jury decisions, but we know that this work doesn't go away. And so I think that as much as, you know, these conversations are difficult to have, and as educators, arts educators, we have a plan and we're supposed to stick to it, but we have to be willing to, you know, again, like I said, throw out the curriculum and to make this work relevant. And so in some of the out-of-school time work that we fund here, we always say that young people vote with their feet, and they get to be the age where if something is not relevant, it's not interesting, it's not connected to them, they don't show up. And so what might seem as something as sort of risking what you had planned, you could be actually risking the relevancy and the validity of the work that you're doing. And I think that, you know, artists are really open to have those sorts of conversations about being authentic and real and relevant when it comes to their art. But I think that there's a real opportunity in this moment to bring that thinking, that way of being, to these other issues as well.
Yeah, I wonder if anyone can just say more about, you know, that sort of, I think, Melanie, you just said that thinking, that way of being. What is it that we're talking about when we talk about a kind of a particular way of being that artists have? That are artists really better at talking about these issues than anybody else?
No, I don't think so. But I think it's being able. I think that I think we tell ourselves, and I mean people, I think we tell ourselves that you have to have certain skills to have conversations about race and power and privilege. And on some levels you do, right? These are very complex terms and complex issues, so you don't want someone engaging in these conversations that they don't know what they're doing. So I don't think that artists are able to talk about these things in a way that other people aren't. But I think if they could walk some of their natural skills and ways of seeing the world over to these conversations, then I think they can be uniquely positioned to move these conversations along in a way that other people can. I'll use an example. One of my portfolios that I have here is around youth-led social change and youth organizing. And so we're funding groups to mostly around education, but it's not all education. We're funding young people to get through organizations. We have 8 different organizations to get training to become organizers. So we've had a couple of wins. We had a group of students that got a Student Bill of Rights ratified at the school district last year. Yeah, it was great work. We fund a group called Dreams of Hope, and they do cultural arts organizing with LGBTQ youth. And, you know, trying to communicate to my board that this work was, you know, it's real work. There's scholarship around it. There's histories of youth organizing. Every social movement in history has had strong youth. It's been youth-led, really. If you look at the civil rights movement, young people really held it together. If anyone has seen the movie Selma, it's really the message. One of the messages that comes out of that is the power of young people. I think we see that now in Ferguson. We see that in New York. And, you know, I was sort of, people never, I would say folks here never really understood what this work was, right? People understand youth development. They understand youth civic engagement, youth leadership. But when I talked about organizing, it was really hard to say that this is a real thing that young people are doing. And then we had this idea to use a video and have the young people work with GAP, which is the Global Action Project, to, I see Marit smiling, so she knows that organization, to have them create a video. And they created the content, they shot the video, they edited it, they did everything. And it wasn't until we used an artistic medium to communicate the story that everyone in the boardroom was like, oh, I get it. Like, it makes sense. And so I do think that it is a powerful tool and way of thinking and way of showing people and tapping into people's personal experiences, and they get to watch something and hear a person's voice, and art can do all of those things. And that to me is just an example where it does carry on a conversation. It does transfer a message or begin a conversation in ways that other things can't.
Right. Great.
Yeah.
Marit, yeah.
Oh, I was just going to say, like, just with what Melanie was saying, that I think that idea of, again, yeah, artists aren't naturally able to have comfortable and eloquent conversations about race, power, and privilege and justice. But what they are often able to do, which is kind of like what Rosalie was saying with that idea of the vocabulary, right? And that we are trained to see things from multiple perspectives. We're trained to see that it's not one way or the other, that you might have layers of meaning, that you might one day look at a work of art and see one thing, and the next day see something else, that there's interpretation, that there's improvisation, that things aren't held down tightly, and that the world doesn't always come out as neatly and tidily as we want it to. And I think what artists can bring to that conversation is the idea that that's okay. Complexity is okay. It's okay to hold two opposing feelings in your hand at the same time and feel them both deeply, and you can express them both deeply, even though they may seem at odds. And I think that's where, in these conversations, when, going back to, Melanie, what you were talking about, that idea of like risking your privilege, right? So you think about those ideas of risk and privilege, even those are kind of disjointed if you take them as separate entities, right? But they go together, and they need to go together in order to make any change happen. And I think there's something about how artists' brains work that they're a little more open to that ambiguity, that complexity, that sense that like, another way is possible. Like, it doesn't have to be just what we see today. Like, it could be something else. And that it could be something else is what we need to constantly have in the conversation, because otherwise we're going to just wither in despair of the fact that, like, essentially our country keeps killing black people on a regular, systematic basis. Not to mention a lot of other people, too. But we're going to just die of despair if we don't have some idea that, like, another way is possible. And I think that's another thing that, as artists, we can offer that, especially in education, where we're working with young people, where we want to get them before the despair gets in too deeply, and to really help them say, like, another world is possible, and here's how we're going to build it together.
So I'm guessing that we're coming up toward the end of our time. I want to put one other thought out and then make sure that each of you got, and I'll turn to Rosalie next, but that each of you got a chance for at least a final comment. We've been talking about artists in a very broad sense, sort of making some big generalizations about artists. And we were talking earlier about a colleague of ours, Charlotte Dixon, who's done some, I think, very interesting research with artists. And one of the things that she found was that of a pretty large sample of visual artists that she interviewed, they kind of tended in three directions in their, what she called their basic orientations. So some of them were oriented towards materials. That's that they work with materials. That's what they do. And they go in the studio, and the materials, they're in a dialogue with materials. Some of them are oriented toward art history. Their work is all in response to work that's gone before and where they see things moving within the realm of visual arts. And some of them, she found, were really oriented to the world, that they engaged with the world, they responded to the world, and you see that in the work that they do. And that's been very striking to me, because when I go to the museum, or when I go to galleries or to open studios, when I'm talking with artists, that actually resonates. Charlotte's work really resonates. And I think that when in this conversation, I feel like we've been talking about a subset of artists. Many of those people do, in fact, become arts educators because they live in the world and they're engaged with the world and they want to be within the world and connect through education. So I just put that out as one more thought, but invite each of you to say, we'll share whatever thought now is in your mind, though I know that we need to wrap up pretty soon. So Rosalie?
Yeah, that's interesting to think of it in those three contexts. I'm trying to think of, as an artist and as an arts educator, which one I'm drawn to. I think what comes to mind immediately is the idea of art history, or sort of outside materials, things that have been passed down through generations as texts or examples of work that can be learned from. And in hearing what Marit said about the contradictions that lie in these conversations, really made me think about the antithesis that I teach in a Shakespeare class, and how I might do a deep dive into that work, but then maybe switch gears and push it towards the another part of that trifecta of the world, and how can we relate that now to the antitheses that lie within our own selves, within our own world, within our communities. And just recently I did an in-depth seminar about Freire's pedagogy of the oppressed, and I remember our professor sort of left us with this sentiment of don't lose sight of the contradictions that are in the world, that's when the despair will set in, when we lose sight of contradictions. And so I'm not sure how all of that connects, but it seemed relevant in like the idea of using really exquisite pieces of art that illuminate the problematic natures of our societies, and then reflecting them back on the world that we live in now.
Lovely, lovely. Melanie?
I also want to just pick up on Marit's point about contradictions, and I think it's so important because I think it's how we bring people to this work, to this movement. And I think if people can look at themselves and say, wow, I let's say I'm a white person who might be uncomfortable when I see, a black man walking down the street, but I understand that what's going on is wrong, right? And I have to deal with these two sides that are reality of something that may be very unconscious, right? It's an unconscious bias that by nature of being in this world, in this country, that I hold, and I have to deal with that. But I also know that what is happening is wrong, and I think there are a number of contradictions that we can bring up. And I really appreciate that point, because I think we tell ourselves that, and Rosalie, to your point about when we don't have those contradictions, there's despair, right? Because if you look at that situation and you say, I have to be one or the other, that's depressing, right? And you don't know that you can bring those, and you can negotiate and navigate through those internal contradictions to really contribute to the change that needs to happen in the larger movement. I'll just say quickly, I think that artists, have an option, have a choice to either reproduce the problems or to remedy them. And I think that's really what the new conversations around arts and arts education will be in the future.
Great. And Marit, final thought?
I think I'm good.
Did you say you think you're good?
Yeah, I think I'm good.
Okay, great. Well, look, obviously this is just to call it a beginning is not fair, because we've all been in these conversations. So it's picking up in the middle and just moving it along. But I really appreciate everybody making the time and taking time out to have this conversation. I made about 7 different post-it notes to myself as you were talking, things that I want to pick up on with each of you. So I want to continue these conversations and look forward to doing that. And I look forward to people maybe doing that on the CTC website and obviously in your own lives with your colleagues. We hope that anybody watching this will continue to do that. It's clearly crucial. So, Elisa, hand it back to you.
Yes, we hope that you'll all continue the conversation on our website. It's aieconversation.org, and there's a place where this video will be archived so you can share it and spread the word, and also add your thoughts to the comment section on the website. Our next studio will be on February 20th, and we look forward to seeing you there. And thank you for joining us today.